Hi, recently I've written this tweet where I say that if I will ever work on a front end again with remote APIs, then I will never do it again without GraphQL. And in this video I will show you why. Let's assume for a minute we are hired by a team that builds a product that is called the Beer Advisor. The Beer Advisor shows beers and ratings of beers and has some views where we can see beers and comments on beers. That is the Beer Advisor. It has beers and comments, and on the other hand it has shops where you can buy beers. And our task is to build a list of shops and a view where you can see a single shop. And unfortunately, all our colleagues that build these applications are not available, probably at holiday, maybe. So we're on our own. And this application is built with GraphQL in the backend and with React in the front end. And today I will show you the tool stack that you can use to build GraphQL front ends. So first of all, what is GraphQL? With GraphQL, your client can query data from the backend, and using a query language, the client can decide itself what it wants to read from the backend, what data. And just to give you a short example, I open a tool called Graphical, and this tool is like a web editor for GraphQL queries that is comparable to SQL Explorer, for example, for databases. In this Graphical, I can enter a GraphQL query on the left side, and we will see the output of the query on the right side. And first we will use this tool to discover the queries that our new views for the shops need. Then we will implement the front end, and you will see a lot of tooling in this. So let's start with entering some text here. A GraphQL query always starts with the word query, and then you select fields from an object graph. And we have some entry points into our object graphs. We have this fields. These are called fields in GraphQL. And as you see, we have beer and beers, and we have shops and so on. When we want to build a list of shops, we probably want to query shops. So let's select that. And you see an error message here. And that is because shops is a list of objects, and we cannot select complete objects, but we can only select fields from objects. So we select the fields that we need for our view here. Like, for example, the ID of a shop, the name of a shop, and maybe the address of a shop. And the address itself is again another object, so we have to select more fields from this object also, maybe street, postal code, and city. Maybe that is enough for our use case. And what you see is that the editor gives you code completion because the editor knows our API, and we can be sure that this query runs. And we also were able to build this query without knowing anything about the API, because we just can use the code completion to navigate through our API. If that is not enough, we find on the right side of this tool, we find documentation. We have our shops field documented here, returns a list of all shops that are part of our network. So this is one thing about GraphQL APIs that you need to know. GraphQL APIs are defined in a schema, and the schema contains objects like our shops, like our address, and it object contains fields like this: ID, name, street, postal code, and city. And these fields have types, and these fields have documentation. So a GraphQL API is a typed API. That's why we see here that we have a field called shops, and the shops field returns a list of shop objects, and we can see also the documentation for a shop object, and so on and so on. So a GraphQL API in general is very good explorable, even if you do not know anything about the concrete API you're working with. So another thing about GraphQL is that please keep in mind our queries always starting at this query type object. Okay, now that we have written this query here, we can execute this query. And you see on the right side, our backend returns some data, some shops. You can see that the result looks like the same as our query. We have on the top level, we ask for shops, and we got shops. And for each shops, we asked for ID and name and received ID and name. So the structure of the query determines the structure of your output. If you write a query, you know how the answer will look like. And just to make sure that, so we can select, we as the client can select what data we need, as long as we are building our queries according to the GraphQL API that we're working against. And before we add it to the front end, there's one more thing about this query. We can add a name for this query, which is called an operation name in GraphQL. And that is mainly used for debugging, or for example, on the server side when the query is executed on the server, but it can also help us in a minute. So I add a name here for the query, like, for example, shops list. So let's go to the front end. I just prepared something so we don't start at the very beginning. So we have a React component called shoplistpage.tsx. It's a TypeScript file. And this file, this page, is already included in our application. We can open it by using shops UL. And then you see to do show a list of shops, name and beers. And each shop should be linked to a detail view. So our first task is to build this list, and we already have the GraphQL query for that. And we insert the GraphQL query in a new file in our project. Let's call it shoplist.query.graphql. And I will copy the, no, that was wrong. I will copy the query to our editor here, to our IDE. And you see that here's also a default GraphQL endpoint configured. So this IDE has built-in GraphQL support, and I can run this query here directly also from my IDE. That is the same as doing it from GraphQL. You see here's our result of our query. And also I have the code completion here directly in my IDE. So if I'm writing code, TypeScript code, JavaScript or something like that, and then I'm switching to writing GraphQL queries, I have the same code completion that I know from writing in another programming language. That is really helpful. So now we have this file where our query is written in, and we can implement our shop list page. Before we actually implement the code, we have to generate some code based on our query. That is something that is provided by a tool called GraphQL-code-generator, which is a project that provides many code generators for a lot of frameworks and languages. And we're using the code generator for TypeScript and the Apollo client, the Apollo GraphQL client for React here. That is already configured in the workspace. I just have to start the code generator, John CodeGen watch. And now this tool watches our changes. And if we're doing something with GraphQL, it will generate code for us. And I will show you that in a minute. Apollo React client normally has a hook function called useQuery. And a useQuery expects such a GraphQL document. That is called a document in GraphQL. And then it executes this query and returns the data, and also gives us some informations about, like, for example, error messages or loading in the states and so on and so on. And using this GraphQL code generator here, a lot of boilerplate code that is normally needed is generated for us. And so we have a custom hook generated for us called use shop list query. Why it's called use shops list query? Because I called my query shops list. So it takes this name and generates this hook function for us. And the hook function already knows that if the function is executed, this query should be run. So this hook function returns, among others, an object with 3 properties: data, loading, and error. And you see that my IDE knows that these 3 properties are contained in this object because everything is tied with TypeScript. And now the life cycle of a query is that it returns loading, Boolean loading, if the query is running, and we don't care about that today. So we just return an indicator. And if we have an error, we return error. That is not very user-friendly, but for today it's enough. I just make sure that we actually have data. If we don't have data, it's probably some very weird problem, but anyway, let's check that. No data. So if we now inspect the data object, you will see data dot that the IDE knows which fields we have queried with our query. So let's open the query again, maybe in a separate view here so we can watch it side by side. So this is our result from our hook function. We queried shops. So first here is shops, and shops is an array. If we, for example, would map over the object, then you will see that the IDE and TypeScript knows what fields our shop is built of, like the ID is a string and our name. And it also knows that we have an address object here. And it also knows, of course, how the address would look like. And in this case, all our fields are of type string. So this is a string, this is a string, 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 string. But there are multiple types in GraphQL. There's also, for example, Boolean or integers. And if we would query for fields in our query that are of type integer or Boolean or something like that, then we would also have the appropriate TypeScript types here. So currently we only have strings. But anyway, the important part is we write this query here. We know the query is correct because if we would make a mistake like this, we would get an error in our IDE. The IDE knows our schema, and we can build our queries using code completion and so on. Then we save, our code is generated, and now we can use the result of this query in a type-safe way because TypeScript knows that we have a shops list query, and that shops list query returns shops with ID, name, address, street, postal code, and city, and so on. So I think this is very, very helpful. Let's do a minor example. That is just demo code. We will add this to our UI in a minute, but let's for 1 second remove, for example, the city from our query. So now if we would run the application, the city would not be part of our result. And of course here we have no city anymore. So this is a compile error. And if this is a runtime error. And if I save now, our generator runs, hopefully. Now it runs. And now the IDE sees this property city does not exist on our type anymore. So we are very, very type safety from the back end to the front end and back. So now use this in our component here. Maybe we have a title called shops, and then we map our data not to this one, but maybe to we make it very, very, very easy. And then we have, for example, shop.name, and we have shop.address.street. And unfortunately, I removed the city here, so I have to again add the city, re-add the city, my code generator, run. And now we can shop address.city, and we can also, of course, display the postal code. So you have an overview of our shops, and we need to return this, of course, and this needs a key, and this is shop.id. So everything is type safe. We've written this query. The query is correct because it's validated against the schema of our GraphQL API. So we can be sure that this is correct. We know that we have the correct data structure here, that we're working with the correct data structure because everything is type safe here. Everything is backed by TypeScript. Let's save again and then go back to our browser. And let's see how our view now looks like. And you see it does not look very, very good, but at least see all the data that we have queried. So we have our shops here. And now I want to make a second query, and the second query or the second view should show a single shop, including the beer it sells. So let's go and create a new GraphQL file, new file, single shop.query.graphql, for example, single shop. And in this case, we query for the shop field. And a field in GraphQL can have arguments, like arguments in a programming function, like in a function of a programming language. And also these arguments have types, so names and types. So we have a field an argument called shop ID, and this is of type ID. And we could, for example, query the first shop with this query. And from this shop, again, I want to have my address, my name, the ID, the address. Maybe again, we want to display all these informations, maybe not. And we also want to display what beers we can buy in this shop. And therefore, we query the beers file that is defined on our shop type. So, by the way, even in this IDE, if I go with the mouse over a field, you see the documentation from our GraphQL APIs. And again, this returns a list of beers. And from each beer, we want to have the ID and the name. So I save this and just try it out. I run this, and you see here we have received the result. We have our shop, the ID S1, as we queried here, with name, address, beers. Unfortunately, we have some part here that changes depending on the shop that we want to show. And for this reason, we can use variables in GraphQL. And to use a variable in a GraphQL statement, we have to declare the variable with a name and a type. And the name has to start with $sign. Let's do this like, and we call our variable shop ID. And it must be of type ID exclamation mark, because the shop ID here, where we want to use our variable, is from type is of type ID exclamation mark. Let's see again. Unfortunately not, but we see here in the documentation shop ID exclamation mark. This is the type we have to use for our variable also. So now we declared this variable. Now we're going to receive an error because this variable is not used. So unused variables in GraphQL queries are an error. But of course, we want to use this variable here. So and now when we run this query, we have to specify not only the query itself, but also the value for this variable, of course. Like I've saved. And again, our code generator run, our single shop page should be opened when clicking on an entry in our list of shops. So I add a link here, link to shop plus shop.id. That is the path to our single shop page. Let's go to the browser. So here we have our list now with links to the single shops and to the single shop page. And if we click on one shop, the URL now contains the ID of the shop that we want to display. Let's implement that. Go to the shop page, and we are using the React router. So we're using code like this to receive the shop ID from our URL. Use params. So, and this is the ID that we have to give to our GraphQL query here. So our GraphQL code generator already ran, and so there's a new hook called use single shop query, and the return value of this hook is the same as before. We have loading, we have error, we have data. Let's again write some very easy code here, some very stupid UI code. Return h1 error. And also if we not have received any data, or if we not have received any shop, because the shop can be null in this case, because we can of course search for a shop that is not known in our system. So the shop field, let's see if we can see this here. This returns a shop. And if there's no exclamation mark at the end, then this means in the GraphQL schema language, that means that this field can return null, while you see here this exclamation mark, which means this can never be null. Also here, for example, the name is of string exclamation mark, and exclamation mark always means there is a value coming back. If you ask for this value, you get something. Shop is an optional field. It might return null if the shop that we queried for does not return. So if we either have no data or we have no shop, then we return h1, sorry, no shop. Now let's go to this error message here. The problem why this is red here is because we have to specify this variable. So our hook function here not only knows what is coming back from our query and how our query result looks like, but it also knows what variables we have to specify. So let's add this. And using this configuration object, we can specify a variables object, and the TypeScript knows how our variables look like. In this case, it's just the shop ID variable that we have to specify. If you specify variables, it's always without this $sign at the beginning. So, and we took the shop ID from our URL. So the page renders, we extract the shop ID from the URL, we pass it to our GraphQL query. The GraphQL query runs with this shop ID, and then again we get loading while the query is running. We get an error if the query failed, or we get data with or without shop when the query returns successfully. And now we can display the shop, and this is the same as in the example before. TypeScript now knows how our shop looks like. We have our name again, and we have a list of beers here. That is the most important part. Data.shop.beers, and again we map them. Beer, maybe li beer.name, and the key is beer.id. So this is React specific how we write our UI, but the fact that TypeScript knows about our types, this is not restricted to React. This GraphQL code generator that also works for other frameworks, like for example for Angular, and you have the same features. Of course, the API looks different in Angular, but you have the same feature. You write your query, you generate code for that, and your type safety in your UI code. We also want to display the address, and before we display the address, let's have a look what our browser says now. I save, and I'm going to the to our shop page, and you see these are the beers our shop sells. Maybe we add a beers title. So this shop sells these beers. And now I also want to display the address of the shop. And you remember in our shop list page, we also displayed the address. And I want to build now a component that we can use for displaying this kind of addresses here. And in the first step, I built a component called shop address. And I move this code here. And of course, now we need the shop, and we will pass the shop as a React property, address props, and we have a shop. And now we need, of course, we need a TypeScript type for this shop here. And there are several ways we can deal with this problem. The first thing is we could define an own type for this component like this. Our shop has a name, a string, and it has an address. And the address has a street, and the address has a postal code, and this is also a string, and it has a city, which is also a string. We will change this in a minute, but for now, this is option 1, define your own type. And then we get this from our shop address props. So our component passes a property object. This is React specific again. And the properties object, the props object, contains one property. This is called shop, and this shop represents shop in our from our query. So we can use our new component here in on our list page, show address, and the shop is shop. So we iterate over the list of shops, and then we pass the shop address to the shop address component. And by the way, the name is too much because the name is not part of the address. So we can display this here, shop.name. So this will not be the most beautiful component in the world, but we focus on type safety, so, and not on UI. And here, of course, we remove the shop. And maybe we can even simplify that then, because then it's probably enough to use the address here. So we can use the address only, and we remove the shop here. And as you see now, the invocation of this component is wrong because the component doesn't need a shop anymore, but an address. So we put the address here. And of course, this must be called address. So let's see, go back to our shops list. Now the list is getting a little bit larger and a little bit more ugly. So I changed back this H2 to a B tag. And it still doesn't look very nice, but for today it's enough, I think. So we have our name and we have our address component here. And I'm sorry, but I can't resist. We need to make some line breaks here and maybe postal code and city on one line. Maybe that looks at least a little bit better. Not really, but anyway. So now we received, in this component, we received data from a GraphQL query, and we pass parts of this GraphQL query, the address of a shop, to this shop address component. And for the shop address component, we have written our own type. And let's, for example, say this type does not match the address type of our shop object that is generated by the GraphQL code generator. Let's say this is maybe not called postal code, but only code, for example. Then, of course, we get an error message because the object that we read from the GraphQL query does not match our properties object here. So we're type safe. I revert this change to postal code again, so we're fine. Even if you define your own types here and you're passing an object that you read from GraphQL, you can be sure that the type of your GraphQL object or part of your GraphQL object matches this type. That is very important. And this is a feature in TypeScript that is called structural identity. Two types are considered equal if they have the same fields and the fields have the same types. And in this case, shop address consists of street, postal code, and city, and all those properties are strings exactly as this type that we defined here. So that is option number one. So make sure that this thing works as expected. I'm going to the shop list query and I remove the postal code at all from our query, and I save. And the code generator runs. You can see this here. Very good. And then we get an error message here because now this address object does not contain the postal code anymore that is required here. So let's revert this change again, save, and then code generator runs. Everything is fine again. So you can be sure that you were processing the result of your query correctly in your application. And another way would be not to define your own type, but you could also do something like that in your TypeScript code. You can say our shop address, shops list query. That is the result type of our query, and from the result type, it's the shops array. And because it's an array, we need to read the first one, that is TypeScript, and then we can access the type of the address. So this expression here in TypeScript means from this type, give me the type of the shops property. And because this is an array, we have to write this 0 here. And then from the returned object, which is some shop object, then I want to have the type of the address field. And now we can use this shop address here in for our props. It would be like a address, shop address, and now you see everything is green again. So this is another way to get the type of a query. You can extract the type of a query like this, and then you can pass down parts of your query to other components, and you can this is option number 2. So option number 1 is define your own address type. Number 2 is read this from your query. So number 3 is, or option number 3 is, you can define a so-called fragment in GraphQL. And a fragment is like a predefined set of fields that I want to query from a type. And in this case, we could build a fragment for exactly these 3 fields on our address object. And a fragment is written like this, fragment, and we call it, for example, shop address. it's defined on the type address. And from the address, we want to have the street, the postal code, and the city, exactly what we have queried here. And instead of writing this three fields here and in our single shop query, we can now use this fragment here by writing 3 dots and then shop address. You see again the code completion here. So now I save and the code generator again runs. And now we have a type here that is called shop address fragment. And that is exactly these 3 fields here. So now we have our shop address component here that displays the address of a shop. And this is this component we also want to use on the shop page. So I export this component here. In real life, you probably would put it into a separate file, but for now it's enough to just export it. And then we go to our shop page component, and we have the address here from our shop query. And here we want to display the address, maybe before the beers or after, doesn't matter for today, address. And then we use our shop address component and we specify the address. And now, unfortunately, it's red here. And if we go with the mouse over, we see a very, very long error message. And the problem is here in this case that my single shop query does not query the same 3 fields that we need. We need street, postal code, and city. And we queried city, country, and postal code. So we queried the country, but not the street. And that's why our result in our single shop page does not match the expected address format of this component. So again, we have this type safety. We cannot make it wrong, or if we make it wrong, we get very, very long error messages. So we can fix this query. We can remove the country because we don't need it. And then we can query for the street, option number 1. Or option number 2 would be, of course, to use the fragment that we defined here. Both approaches work. Shop address, save, it's recompiling, and hopefully now the problem here disappears. Now it works. And now we can go to the browser and we see a list of shops, of course, and just open one shop. And then we see the address component also here. So we have type safety in our GraphQL API, in our React API. I think that is very, very big benefit of GraphQL, that we have this typed API. So one last thing I want to build, and that is a slightly addition to our beer page. On the beer page, we also see a beer, and we see shops selling those beers. And I want to link this to our new beer page. I already prepared this link here. So we just link to our new page. Now we have links here. I've saved the file, and the browser's updated our application. And we now can go from our shops list to a shop, and from the beer list also to the shop page. And maybe we can also link from the beers here to the beer page. We can just add a link here, and that must be beer plus beer.id. So we added a link from our shop page to the beer page. And now we can navigate around here. So, and the reason why I added this navigation is because I want to show you one feature here. The thing is that after I've written my query that I want to use GraphQL in the front end, there was a reply coming in, and the reply looked like this. It was by Gunnar Morling, which is a friend of mine, and he said, okay, but won't you run into caching problems? And Gunnar is a friend of me, and we always joke about caching in GraphQL because there are some people saying that you can't cache in GraphQL. And so Gunnar's answer always is, when I'm writing something about GraphQL, he answered with their caching problems. So this is not a serious question by Gunnar, but it is a serious question by many people. So because so many people are concerned about caching GraphQL, I will just give you a very short example what's possible in GraphQL with caching. So go to the browser. We reload this shop page now, and you see there's one GraphQL request running that loads the data for this page. we go to this beer page. Again, another GraphQL query runs because the data for the beer page has to be loaded. And now, let's clean this. I go back to our shop page and you see no requests anymore because the requests are already loaded and are cached now in our front end. Let's go back to the beer. No request here because the data is already in the cache. This Apollo client has a cache, and you can inspect and you see everything that has been fetched before is stored in the cache. And if you need the data again, then it first tries to find the data in the cache. And if the data is not in the cache, then it does a query to the backend. And when talking about caching, I recently found a slide about caching architecture that was done by Alex Blewett on a conference, and that is about the beer cache hierarchy. And I think this is a perfect image also for our web edition beer cache hierarchy. You see several layers of caching here, and you see different layers of like how to get a beer here and how far away is the beer. And the first layer, the app layer, like directly in your front end, this is the same as you have beer in your mouth. The browser cache probably would, you have beer in the hand, but it's still not in your mouth. CDN, content delivery network, could be like beer is in the ice bucket, and so on and so on. So you see you have a lot of layers when a web request runs from a front end to a back end. And there might be some layers that might not be very appropriate for GraphQL queries caching, but even some not appropriate, there are still a lot of layers left can be used to cache. If your main and maybe your only concern about GraphQL is caching, then my suggestion is to get a beer, relax, let's talk about caching in GraphQL, and let's talk about GraphQL in general. I think there are some solutions to this problem. Maybe it's not even a problem. Okay, this was a very long video this time. I hope you enjoyed it anyway. I hope you enjoy GraphQL. And yeah, see you next time. Cheers.